I should place myself in some ways the way that Rod placed himself to some extent. Like the poet Dana Gioia, who writes in this volume and who Rod mentioned at length. I do think of LA as my own, as my place. 5 generations of my family have lived in this county, and I feel a kind of ancestral connection here. And I also live in a somewhat insular community within Los Angeles County where, just like Rod, I have chickens in my backyard. Sometimes I think these days having chickens in your yard is a marker of being rooted in a place. At the same time, I lived through, on my way here today, a long-time nightmare, which is that I got stuck in bad traffic even by Los Angeles standards in trying to get here, and I worried I wouldn't make it on time. And that caused me to reflect on the fact, I was inclined to reflect on these themes, given that I was heading here, that LA is this place that's placed and placeless all at once. That part of the marvelous paradox and circus of living here is accepting that, this strange paradox of feeling at the same time placed and placeless. Sometimes it seems to me that LA is a kind of one-legged stripper of a city. It's strange, it's unexpected, it's marvelous and memorable, and just slightly, in the end, off-kilter, just slightly disturbing. But disturbing or not, I'm honored to be here today. I'm honored to be responding to such thought-provoking comments from Rod Dreher. And I'd be honored to be standing in the company of the editors of such a wonderful book, Why Place Matters, or why I call it Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Well, I should say, though, thinking about Why Place Matters, that my husband yesterday pointed out that having a panel of respondents whose last names are McClay, McAllister, and McWilliams suggests perhaps that place does not matter, that in the end it is the ancient tribal linkages that endure and prove definitive, even in this placeless world, even in our long and lasting distance from Mother Scotland. But let me return to the country that is more proximately ours and my own. The person who I regard as the smartest of the founding fathers, I mean, of course, Abigail Adams, once wrote to her husband that Americans seemed to have replaced the old set of nobility with what she called, quote, a new set of mobility. She wrote that to her husband only a year after the penning of the Declaration, and fully a decade before the Constitutional Convention, in a letter where she observed that central to the emerging American culture was a penchant for and fascination with movement. Against an aristocratic system which did root families and locate people in distinct places, early Americans, she said, pursued a kind of democratic life which they understood as freedoms made manifest in motion. By the time Alexis de Tocqueville came to the United States 50 years later, it was that kind of motion that struck him again and again. That description that he uses repeatedly in Democracy in America, of Americans as restless, is really, really telling, for it describes not just a psychic condition, and for Tocqueville it did describe a kind of psychic condition, but it described to him a physical condition as well. The placeless condition of the American populace, and in some ways the placeless aspirations of the American populace. Perhaps even more telling than Tocqueville's famous description of Americans as restive or restless is the way Tocqueville describes what happened to him when he went to Saginaw, Michigan. This is in an essay that's less read of Tocqueville's called A Fortnight in the Wilderness, where he describes visiting what was then the western frontier of the United States. It's an interesting piece in that, among other things, it's the only thing that Tocqueville wrote about America while he was in America. And in that essay, he reports being astounded, above all else, by the fact that virtually no American built a house or put down roots in a community with any intention of staying there. He describes the pioneer dwelling as these ramshackle shacks that are set up amid fields of stumps that have been hastily cut down by settlers who themselves plan to move on somewhere else and whose children certainly will move on somewhere else. And as he's reflecting on this, he issues that what is, to me, one of Tocqueville's most prophetic lines. And this is a serious claim on my part, since I know I'm not alone in this room in believing that Tocqueville is nothing but prophetic lines. But to me, one of Tocqueville's most prophetic lines happens when he's talking about this phenomenon. Americans, he says in this essay, are a, quote, migratory race, which neither rivers nor lakes can stop, before which the forest falls and the prairie becomes covered with foliage, and which, having reached the Pacific Ocean, will retrace its steps to disturb and destroy the social communities which it will have formed and left behind. Tocqueville didn't need to know anything about automobiles to know what was coming. I think if we want to confront the problem of placelessness in the United States today, and I'm certainly with the other panelists today in thinking that placelessness is a problem in the United States today, if we want to confront the problem of placelessness in the United States today, it's not just the present moment or even the recent past that we must confront. Placelessness has been embedded in the aspirations of the American project since the very beginning. One of the details I think that it can be easy to overlook in the Federalist Papers is the emphasis that its authors place on the importance of roads. They tell us, in fact, that one of the most important objects of the proposed Constitution is to ensure that, quote, the intercourse throughout the Union will be daily facilitated by new improvements, by the building of roads that are faster to travel, by the multiplication of lodging for travelers, by the making of navigation within the country more effortless, and by the improvement of communication between East and West. So again, long before the steam engine, or the telephone, or the internet made their grisly incursions onto the landscape, the framers of this American government had mapped out a regime in which discrete places were meant to become less discrete. They tell that to you right in the Federalist Papers. I mean, really think in some ways about the weirdness and the importance of this. That there is seriously a moment in the Federalist Papers in which Publius promises that the Constitution will bring us more roadside lodging and that we should regard that as a benefit of the Constitution. Well, Bill and Ted tell us in the preface to this book, and it's one of the memorable lines in the preface of this book, that one cannot be a citizen of a motel, a proposition with which I am inclined to agree. The authors of the Federalist actually seem to suggest that citizenship and motel availability are actually bound up together. It's hard to avoid the conclusion that in terms of the American founding, there's a kind of foundational problem here. Of course, for those of us who talk about the importance of place, it's usually not the authors of the Federalist Papers to whom we turn when we want to find a champion among the American founders. Most often, in my experience, and I've been in these conversations recently with Ted and others, we defenders of the idea that place matters will turn to Jefferson and the so-called Jeffersonian ideal of localized agrarian politics when we're looking to find a spokesperson among the founders. But as appealing as that ideal is, that Jeffersonian ideal, we can't really ignore the fact that Jefferson himself is a pretty terrible role model and spokesperson on the matter of thinking that place matters. Though he was born and did die in Virginia, Jefferson was throughout his life a cosmopolitan who traveled widely, for long stretches lived far from home, who was always himself engaged in cosmopolitan currents of thought and literature, who believed that even in a country of farmers, it would be a class of cosmopolitan elites who would rule and set the proper terms for national life, and who even had moments of envisioning all nations dissolving into a world society. We must confront, I think, in other words, the very difficult fact that in and even prior to the constitutional framing of this country, this has been a nation whose elites have always had certain hostilities to the idea and practice of living in place. Today, when my students, all of whom have either been born or have been mostly bred to become cultural elites, when my students talk about their ambitions, few of them say they want to go back from whence they came. It's not hard to see why they say that and why their ambition tends to be that they want to go to one of a very select number of cosmopolitan cities. At Pomona, they call them the Big Five, right? The places that matter, these cosmopolitan places. It's not hard to see why they say that kind of thing and why they have such cosmopolitan ambitions. They've been well schooled by their parents, by their teachers, by popular culture, and indeed even by history, in the principle that cosmopolitanism is a marker of class, a marker of status, and a marker of success. They all noticed a recent experiment, which maybe some of you noticed as well, in which a number of prominent business leaders were shown a series of passports from different countries: American passport, Swiss passport, Ugandan passport, Bolivian passport, Brazilian passport, and said if you were to choose among any of these passports, which, you choose where you want to be a citizen, which would you choose? And almost without exception, these business leaders said, doesn't matter to me. All of the important ties in my life are not even limited by questions of national citizenship. My money operates on an international level. My friends are spread across the world. My business does not need to rely on being in any particular place. My students notice things like this. In other words, my students see how, in contemporary life, cosmopolitanism is associated with all kinds of power, with economic power, with cultural power, with intellectual power, and with political power. I also think we can't neglect the fact that, as so many essays in this volume make clear, as is so clear to all of us, it almost doesn't even require saying, recent and contemporary technologies aggravate the placelessness that has always been part of American life. I was thinking about this too on my way here, when the thing that calmed me down in my condition of placeless limbo between Claremont and Malibu was the fact that I had a cell phone, and that I could, from my placeless condition, call Pepperdine and track down Ted McAllister, and I knew that I would be able to locate myself for him in this placeless world, and I could therefore drive to Malibu with somewhat of a lesser degree of anxiety. That is, our technology both enables and encourages the conditions of placelessness by making our condition of placelessness more tolerable to us in discrete moments. I think we certainly need to confront, as so many of the essays in this volume make clear, the fact that our contemporary technologies, even as they say they're connecting us, really effectively make our lives more placeless. They enable us and encourage us to be more placeless. So the big question for me is, how do we think about placemaking in a nation which has, in large measure, always been devoted to, and it is increasingly devoted to, making or setting the terms for a placeless life? This really is, I think, the central question. I'm going to offer just a few suggestions about how we might start to think about what we might start to do about placemaking in a nation which has, in large measure, always been hostile to placemaking. The first thing I think we need to recognize is that the work of placemaking is going to be work in this culture. It's going to be an intentional act. Even if placedness, even if our attraction, even if the reason that place matters has to do with truths about our human nature, that we are these particularly embodied creatures who are born and die in discrete places, as our editors are so fine in making clear from the very first pages of this book. Even if placeness has to do with truths about our nature, the society in which we habit has so denatured us from that fact that it's a kind of work, it will be a kind of work to reorient ourselves toward that kind of truth. So the first thing I think we have to recognize is that this work has to be work. It's been interesting to me along these lines that so many intentional communities have started to spring up in the last couple decades, where Americans are trying to get back to older kinds of communities. Right? We will build, most recently, these agricultural gated communities that are springing up in the Southwest, where instead of a gated community being organized around a golf course, they're organized around a farm. If you haven't read about these, one of them is called Agritopia. You should. I think they suggest something both disturbing and something promising for those of us who care about place in contemporary America. Second, I think, and I'm echoing Ted here, we have to interrogate our long-standing cultural association of class membership, elite class membership, with cosmopolitanism. We need to find ways, those of us who are teachers, to encourage especially bright students to at least consider the possibility that the marker of success isn't how far away you can get from the place you were born. We need to confront the fact that in this country, economic segregation maps on quite neatly to geographic segregation. We have to talk about inequality in the way that I think Ted has already encouraged us to talk about inequality. This will certainly be tough to do, but again, I think it's one of the first things we have to do. Third, I really want to echo Rod in saying that we have to talk more about who we are as creatures. We have to be willing to talk about death. I'm too am haunted by somebody who died young in my life. My best friend died a few months ago of breast cancer. And one of the things she said to me a few weeks before she died, she said, "Sue, I'm in the wrong place. I'm dying in the wrong place." At the end of her life, the concern that stuck with her, even though she was surrounded by her family, she felt like she was in the wrong place. Thinking about death, the terms of our life and death, the fact that in the end we do end up in one place, is imperative for us, I think. But in this culture, which is so notoriously organized around deathlessness, the fantasy of deathlessness, the institutionalization of deathlessness, that's a serious problem. I think there is a lot of work, in other words, that we would have to do to really create a nation where place is to matter more or substantially more than it does now. That said, I think I want to end on a more positive note. I want to say that those of us who do care about place and placemaking, I think should take heart from what I see as a clear cultural longing for placeness, that Americans might not be able to articulate in their own words, but show to us in something as simple as the popular culture that they consume. I'm thinking in particular about the success of two shows on television right now. Two of the most popular shows on television are both about families in California, speaking about Modern Family and Parenthood. And to me, they both show a kind of longing for place. Both shows describe or present to us multi-generational families who live in close proximity to each other, where the children have all returned home to be near their parents and their grandparents, where they're all located firmly in place, where their lives as members of the community matter, where the members of the families work and live in close proximity to each other, where there are lots of family gatherings and reunions. And in fact, interestingly, in both shows, a member of the family is shown as running for local office. The fact that Americans are attracted to these two shows, on the surface very different, Modern Family and Parenthood, which showcase the possibility of a multi-generational family living in a place like California that has serious ties to each other and to their land, to the place where they live, I think says something important. The stories that Americans are consuming, the stories that Americans are telling ourselves, in other words, or watching ourselves, show to me that deep below, even given all the forces of placelessness in our lives, we all, in the end, want to imagine, or are happy imagining, a home place, a place where place really matters, a place where we're really recognized as individuals and as members of an association, places that are really worth calling home in the end.